Hopefully this is being recorded.
It does show it, because I see on the left upper hand part, it says recording with the little dot. Do you see it?
I do. Yes, I see it now. Okay, great. Awesome. Yep, I got it. Thank you. Thank you, Edna, for troubleshooting our, our interview today. Thanks so much. We're going to have to pay you a little bit extra for tech support.
I know. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls these days. So.
Yeah, good for you, because like I said, I have been avoiding them. Like from school, I've been getting all these invites for meetings and stuff, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm not going to do that today. I've not yet embraced the pandemic reality that everything now has to be done on Zoom. Apparently, like, and it's interesting too, because even when you watch other YouTube shows that normally use a different program to record their interviews, they're now all using Zoom too. So everyone has just picked up Zoom and switched over to that. So anyway, speaking of picking things up, let's get on with our interview. Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Mutes, creator of the Left Pocket Project, which brings you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the Left Pocket Project podcast. On today's episode, we have a discussion once again about the Rona, but from a very unique perspective. We'll be speaking with a special guest, whom I'll describe in just a moment. But first, I'd just like to remind everyone to check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and wherever you get your social media. Of course, SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, and wherever you get your podcasts. And last but not least, to check us out on Patreon, where you can find not only free episodes of the podcast, and of course, everything is free on our Patreon, but also additional resources such as reading lists, readings themselves, and all sorts of other goodies. You can find us there at patreon.com/leftpoc, and that's LEFTPOC. And of course, Left POC is how you can find us on all spaces online. Now on with the show. Today, we speak with Edna Bonhomme, who's a historian, lecturer, and writer whose work interrogates the archaeology of post-colonial science, embodiment, and surveillance in the Middle East and North Africa. A central question of her work asks, what makes people sick? As a researcher, she answers this question by exploring the spaces and modalities of care and toxicity that shape the possibility for repair using testimony and counter-archives. Her dissertation, Plagued Bodies and Spaces, explored the history of epidemics in North Africa and the Middle East. Edna earned her PhD in history from Princeton University in 2017 and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and she currently lives in Berlin, Germany. She has written for Al Jazeera, The Baffler, The Nation, and several other publications. You can follow her on Twitter at Jacobinoir, which we will spell out and have in the show notes. Also, I just want to say, please check out the show notes. As per always, they contain excellent articles and information, but in this case, almost all of the articles we list are actually from our special guests. So please check them out. She has a lot of amazing work, and you'll be sorely mistaken if you don't take a read or two. So definitely check that out. Please accept my apologies for all of the technical difficulties. As you could hear from our opening, we had quite a few. We had to switch from multiple formats of recording this, so there are a few moments when the recording jumps and skips, and we have just some generally bad audio this time around, but please don't hold it against us. This is a great interview. I hope you all enjoy it. Thanks. So first of all, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Edna, for being with us. And I really look forward to our discussion because you've got a mix of some historical stuff, as well as some contemporary stuff, and a lot of really interesting things that relate to kind of linking the past and present with regard to our current situation. But the first of those questions that I have actually is if you could get us started by talking about your doctoral research and sort of what you're doing now, because I know that you've had some shifts over time, and I'd be curious to know kind of, first where your research began, how it got started, what it is now, and how you think it connects to our current conditions.
So first of all, I just want to say that I commend you for the work that you guys do, and thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation, especially in the midst of a pandemic. And I know a lot of people are finding it difficult, especially with childcare and other kinds of responsibilities. So thank you for taking the time to put this message out there. And I guess I want to start a bit by saying, at least with my doctoral dissertation, it was very much a circuitous route. So I did my PhD in history at Princeton University, and the dissertation that I worked on was called Plague, Bodies, and Spaces, looking at the bubonic plague and epidemics more broadly in Egypt, Tunisia, and North Africa. And it seems a bit of a kind of anomaly for myself, a Black Haitian American, to have jumped into that topic. But it very much relates to my personal and political history. On one hand, I, as someone who grew up in the United States with Haitian immigrant parents, had to witness in some ways the ways in which Haitians were seen and perceived to be vectors of disease, specifically with the HIV/AIDS crisis, and how that HIV/AIDS in many ways became the modern plague. And so for me, ideas and conceptions about diseases and how they flourish very much was tied to how people within my background were seen as perhaps spreading a certain kind of epidemic. And then beyond that, my interest in studying the Middle East and North Africa very much stemmed from the very horrible event of the United States invading Iraq in 2003, and wanting to understand a region that had been demonized by the US a bit more. And part of what for me was very discouraging about the US militarization project is how it not only caused the death and lives of so many people, but that militarization has also contributed to very much a public contamination and exposure to toxic metals. And according to the Sharif al-Arwachi of the Baghdad Center in southern Iraq, there have been escalating cancer rates since the US invasion of Iraq because of depleted uranium, some weapons, etc. So the kind of horror that the country that I was born in happened, and how it's been causing a kind of medical apartheid and a kind of increased morbidity and mortality in the Middle East and North Africa is something I kind of wanted to engage in. But I didn't want to just look at the suffering of the region. I also wanted to understand the history of intellectual formations of medicine and science and how they actually emerged from that region. So reading the works of Ibn Sina, the canon of medicine, but also looking at health studies in the context of current scholars like Soya Bayumi, who is at Harvard University, Khaled Fahmy, who's written on medical examinations and autopsies in Egypt, Mariel Shafri, who's looked at the ways in which we understand ideas about Darwin in the Middle East and what that looks like. So there's so much work that has been done, both in like the medieval period, but also today. So the dissertation work stems from me engaging in a very active way with some of that material and trying to undo the violent nature of US imperialism through scholarship, through making organic connections with people on the ground, and to actually go to the archives of the region. So I spent time going to the archives in Tunisia and Egypt, as well as in France and UK, and here in Germany where I currently live. And it's in the process of going through the archives that I saw that there was a set of plague epidemics that were happening in the 18th century. Sometimes they were attributed to trade. Sometimes they were attributed to divine spirits. Sometimes they were attributed to colonialism. And part of what I wanted to do is to see what was the relationship between events such as the Napoleon expedition of 1798 and the bubonic plague outbreaks that happened around that time, while also thinking about what were the medical institutions that were already in place in Egypt, for example, in Alexandria and in Tunis, and what did public health, or what I call proto-public health reforms, look like in that period. So the dissertation very much is, or what was focusing on some of those elements, the kind of intellectual traditions amidst tragedies, but also how what people consider to be Greco-Roman medicine and how Arab scholarship kind of helped to push that forward to what we consider to be modern medicine today. And I think part of why looking at epidemics then matters so much is because it featured into liturgical text, it featured into the popular imagination, people wrote poems about it, and it also is something that is well documented. So looking at, for example, my case, shipping records, trade records, I could see that the plague outbreak of 1798 and the plague outbreak of 1831 very much was important for determining who could enter into port cities such as Tunis and who would have to leave. It very much determined what kinds of border regimes would eventually form. There was a way in which certain bodies were being managed, particularly the bodies of enslaved people. And there was also a way in which new hierarchies about particularly with the British and the French eventually colonized North Africa, new hierarchies of quarantine were also being put into place through the International Sanitary Commission and beyond. So part of what I try to unpack is what is the trajectory and the lineage of medical governance? How did people put it into place? And to what extent does power very much get encapsulated into some of these dynamics? Since the dissertation, I've been working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science. And in some ways, the work that I did for my dissertation, while albeit very enriching, is not the only kind of work that I want to do. In fact, I've tried to, since then, thinking more globally in my work, thinking more in terms of the people who are living today, particularly in Europe, who might be accessing healthcare here, specifically Black folk, migrants, etc., and using the interviews, particularly interviewing African diasporic people who have had a wide range of medical experiences here in Europe, and also trying to document as much as possible the extent to which ideas about sickness and illness creates various anxieties. And so that has meant that I've been trying to, as best as I can, to also think about healing as a mode of praxis and more naturopathic healing, and also how people, especially someone like Audre Lorde, who lived in Berlin, came here as a site of refuge when she was dealing with cancer treatments and trying to build a certain kind of community. So there's been a trajectory from a kind of straightforward historical work that I was very much interested in, one that was political in nature and also narrative, to having more of an interdisciplinary project, one that is also thinking actively about working with medical anthropologists in some cases and with filmmakers and artists here in Berlin.
So one thing that you mentioned kind of had me thinking a lot about what's going on now with regard to U.S. empire. You mentioned that part of what had kind of spurred your work was the war in Iraq, or the invasion of Iraq, to be more specific, and at least in terms of the region that you decided to focus on. And it immediately made me start thinking about Yemen, especially because, one of the things prior to the pandemic that kept coming out about Yemen was not only starvation, of course, that had come about because of the invasion, the U.S.-backed and Saudi-led invasion, but also many cases of cholera. And I started thinking well in advance of the pandemic, what are the ways that empire helps exacerbate health conditions on the ground and problems on the ground with regard to public health. And I also was thinking a bit about the origins of science, specifically because when we think about modern science and modern medicine, while it's often attributed to Europeans, a lot of that stuff, including mathematics, actually came from the Arab world and North Africa, and was then kind of traveled. It then traveled to Europe and other parts of the world. And so I'm wondering, kind of, what does it mean for you as a scholar of this kind of history when you look at, I guess, what I would call like progress interrupted, or a type of handicapping, if you will, of of medical and scientific research and knowledge, and how that interruption is then sort of recaptured later on by the population in some way, and what that means to kind of go back and harken back to older practices that in actuality might be more, more advanced or progressive than what was then put in place by the empire or the imperial power.
Yeah, so I'm going to start backwards with talking about the origins of science and its relationship to empire and how that very much hinders the kind of work that was being done in what is now termed the Global South, and then talk about Yemen. I guess one thing to start off with is, like, I absolutely agree that things like mathematics, algebra, and beyond, and even just some basic anatomy very much came from what is North Africa, the Middle East, and Western Asia. And a lot of that scholarship was being translated in from Greek into Arabic, and then eventually people who were involved in what is now called the Renaissance and the Enlightenment borrowed some of that stuff from people from the Middle East and North Africa. And so there is a way in which imperialism hindered some of that scholarship, but even beyond the Middle East and North Africa, I think it's also important to think about how there was and is currently very much medical practices that are being exercised on the broader African continent, specifically West Africa, Madagascar, Southern Africa, and how many of the herbal and plant medicines that are very much important for healing and have been taken up by pharmaceutical companies have been stolen, ultimately. In fact, Abena da Asare in Bitter Roots very much documents some of those dynamics, how the periwinkle, which has been used for leukemia, emerges from Madagascar. The bitter roots that are used in West Africa have been useful for malaria, or how the hodea has been also useful for combating hunger. And so the ways in which we understand knowledge and medical knowledge or scientific knowledge, and how it often gets wrongly aligned with European achievements. So people will learn about Newton, they'll learn about Einstein, they'll learn about Copernicus, but they don't often learn about the philosophers, named or unnamed, who come from Latin America, the African continent, Asia, etc. And part of that is by design, I would say. And this is why historians of science who are committed to a kind of radical science of the people, one that is that takes into consideration the range of sources, not just textually based, but those that point to materials that have moved, that have circulated, and how people as individuals can actually, from the cultures and societies that are often erased, be living archives. So beyond that, I would also say that you're absolutely right that the war in Yemen, which began the Saudi Arabian-led war against Yemen, which began in 2015, thus far has displaced at least 2 million people, and it has caused a horrific epidemic in Yemen, the cholera epidemic, alongside with everything from malnutrition and other forms of illness and increased maternal mortality. And one of the things that I've actually written about, at least in the past couple of years, is the relationship between the imperial machine in Saudi Arabia and how it has used Yemen in many ways for years as a place of cheap labor and a kind of a place that has had ethno-religious tensions as well. And the war has been one way in which we've seen a major exacerbation of huge health inequalities. I think one of the things that has been particularly egregious is that while the Saudi Arabia, as well as the United Arab Emirates, have participated in that ongoing war, they've also surprisingly donated money to the World Health Organization to provide health services to Yemen, as opposed to doing the work of stopping the war altogether. So there's this weird kind of relationship where neocolonialism and war also comes with this humanitarian aid and this uneven financial relationship that accentuates poverty and illness in the region. So imperialism as it operates in the Yemeni context with the cholera epidemic looks different than what is happening in Iraq with higher rates of cancer because of the US invasion, which looks different from, for example, Haiti, where the UN occupation there contributed to a cholera epidemic. But they all have something in common, which is as soon as you disrupt people's ability to move, live, if they're being bombed and occupied by military regimes, it very much contributes to a lower quality of life. People aren't able to fully live, breathe, and move through space in the way that they're meant to. So if one is going to be in a true kind of humanitarian of any sort, just even on a liberal sense, one has to actually be anti-war, because if people don't have their health and access to actual care, then their humanity is slowly diminishes.
So with regard to being anti-war, obviously that's like a baseline, I would hope, for most people. Yeah. But although I think that is often missing, right? I think that sometimes that's the side of the story that's not spoken of in terms of understanding how to fix things, right? Some people sort of frame, at least in the media, frame the war as the solution as opposed to the cause of the problems and the exacerbation of the problems. I'm curious, though, on that note, what have been, in your research in particular, what have been the responses not only to empire, but of course the disruption of, as you mentioned, of healing practices and things like that by the populations that you studied? And I know, of course, you're working with multiple places, multiple ethnic groups, multiple timelines. So obviously, feel free to be as descriptive or not on this one, because I understand that there's a very diverse range that I'm asking you about, and I don't expect all of the responses to be the same. But if you could sort of categorize and talk a little bit about the ways that people did react to this interruption or disruption of daily life, and in particular healing practices, and then also kind of building on that, how did they respond to specific concerns that arose with the entrance of empire? Because obviously some of those health-related issues were going to be different than what they were facing in their normal quotidian existences.
Yeah, so I would say that with respect to, I'll start off with the work that I've done for my dissertation and the project that I started off with at the Max Planck Institute, which is thinking about Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia as a kind of active laboratory for European empire in the late 19th, early 20th century, especially as with the Egyptian case, it was subjected to the British Protectorate as of 1882. And in that context, while not a full settler colonial imperial context as was the case in Algeria, it was enough to render certain set of hospitals, particularly Alexandria. There were very different hospitals depending on people's religious status that were suddenly developed. So the sense under European imperialism, the medicalization could be stratified and sectarian. So that was one element. Another element being, in some cases, for example, in Libya, recently looking at after the Libyan colonization, or after the Italian colonization of Libya, apologies, which started in 1914, there was an effort to have a settler population, Italian settler population there, and so they had Italian hospitals, laboratories, etc., but it was segregated. So Libyans did not have access to those resources, and in many cases were forced off of their land and then pushed inward into the hinterland. And so that the imperial project there meant that there was what this is a term by Harriet Washington, African-American scholar, medical apartheid. So there was an overt kind of effort to separate medical facilities in the Libyan case. Tunisia was a bit different. There was a bit more autonomy for them compared to Algeria with respect to medical facilities, etc. And one of the things that I find, and this isn't unique to Tunisia, but the French, as early as the late 1800s, when they were developing the Pasteur Institute, they also, like Tunis had one, as well as Madagascar and other parts of the French colonies. And so there was a bit more semi-independence with respect to scholarship, but it wasn't full independence and full relegation to their own autonomy. So for me, what's been important, at least looking at that 19th century context, is to see to what extent in these local contexts, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Tunisia, is there national autonomy? To what extent are people able to exercise traditional medicine into the new emergent biomedical facilities? And to what extent are those things imposed, and what does that actually look like? What I find, and this is also the case today, is that traditional healing practices that were tied to amulets, to not cupping per se, but other forms of magic, ostensibly, don't necessarily enter into biomedical spaces or hospitals in the ways that they were practiced like 200-300 years ago. So unlike, for example, with traditional Chinese medicine, which has been kind of established as a practice, there isn't that same equivalence within North Africa and the Middle East. So the colonial project, as it's operated in the region, has meant that what is often considered to be socially acceptable formal medicine is tied to a biomedical practice that has a lineage and outside of the traditional practices that might have been experienced. It doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't practicing other things, but just that it isn't officially recognized in the way that, for example, traditional Chinese medicine has been accepted as a practice, like acupuncture, cupping, etc. So like in some ways, healing practices are very much political, and they're also an aftermath of what the extent to which colonial projects were implemented into the North African context. I think one element that is particularly interesting to look at and is somewhat understudied, but not necessarily fully, is the question around psychiatry, mental illness, and madness within the region, and how we understand that in the colonial context and beyond. And in the context of Lebanon, for example, a colleague of mine, Lamia Moghnia, who's a medical anthropologist, social worker, has looked at the ways in which psychiatry featured in the Mandate period, so the period in which the French exercised their semi-rule in Lebanon, as well as how that ideas about trauma and psychiatry impact people who lived through the Lebanese Civil War. I think in some ways that kind of research is exciting because it is diachronic, and it looks at ideas about expertise. It looks at how people express emotions and distress, and how the colonial aftermaths very much impact what people are experiencing today. So the question around the asylum and what function that serves, and particularly the modern asylum, is one that I think can speak to the various complexities of colonialism. And it's no accident, actually, that Franz Fanon, as a psychiatrist who was based in Algeria, could see how damaging the French colonial project was to Algerians, and could witness, document, and really get to the core of the physical illness that the colonialism provided. So but given that, I don't think the thing that makes psychiatry and mental illness so complex is that there's not a magic bullet. It's not like, well, if I have cholera, then I just have to have access to clean water, take an antibiotic, and then hopefully rest. With mental illness and the kind of long array of trauma and how it wears on people, the healing practices and solutions that people propose may not always be immediate, and it is something that is challenging to study in a kind of humane way, especially with living subjects, or in an ethical way if there are materials that hinder people's privacy. So yeah, so all this is just to say that there's so many complexities and layers to what colonialism does with respect to the formation of science and medicine, as well as how people take that up depending on the local context. And then beyond that, healing might not be such a straightforward thing, especially when it comes to mental illness, psychiatry, and madness more broadly.
So I wanted to just comment on a few things that I thought has been very enlightening thus far. I think you've done an amazing job of really kind of capturing the all-encompassing nature of the kind of racial tension or the racialism of the medical practices around the world, and then scientifically speaking as well, and just how kind of overwhelming it can be for different cultures and societies throughout history and around the globe. And that is just, I mean, it's almost overwhelming for me emotionally to think about just how much is lost to us today as a result of all of that, and just how much harm was caused also. And then one of the other things that just stuck out to me, particularly was towards your last point, was about the kind of medical apartheid and the racialized medicine, especially in the mental illness field, just because even in Western medicine, we're still very experimental and still discovering and trying to understand these things and take a much more pharmacological approach versus a somewhat more holistic approach that you may see in some of these other groups that have been damaged by these type of imperialist practices. And we also find that while there's some benefit to the pharmacological aspects, that it's when combined with a more holistic approach that these kind of illnesses are addressed, and then also just the categorization of different types of illnesses and how they're perceived and understood, and the domination of kind of the Western philosophy of understanding them versus the kind of cultural context that they have within these groups is so different. And to understand and to hear those kinds of concepts reinforced in the way that you're discussing has been enlightening. I guess one of the questions that kind of came to my mind was you did talk about Yemen and what's going on there, and one of the aspects that you mentioned in some of the reading that you provided was about the water and the cholera, and I couldn't help but also think about how we're seeing parallels with the Navajo Nation and not having water, and how that's directly affecting them amid this current current situation. I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot. So, full disclosure, I guess I'll go in the middle and then backwards, which is with the mental illness.
Sorry about that.
No, it's because you touch upon so many different topics that resonate with me, so on a personal level and beyond. And I would say with the mental illness thing that my brother is schizophrenic and has been for some years, and the ways in which for dealing with that as a family member, as a loved one, and how the mental health system in the United States is absolutely ineffective. And this is in Miami, Florida, where the state has done very little to prioritize the healthcare of working class Black people. And if anything, I would agree that, of course, there's a pharmacological kind of benefit that can help to reside some of the major issues that arise from something like schizophrenia, but it is not a solution, like a full solution. If anything, the societal damage of being a Black person in America and how that creates this psychosis of growing up poor and having immigrant parents, not being expected to succeed or to have your mind encouraged in a particular kind of way, is parallel to some of the effects that exacerbate stuff like schizophrenia. So figuring out, I would say, a kind of humanistic, transformative, collective form of healing is something that I think people are now learning to look at and to also use perhaps the traditional forms of practices. Like as a Haitian person of Haitian descent, I'm doing the work of excavating the different forms of healing that are related to herbal medicine. So talking to my elders and my family, my aunts, like, what is this tea used for? What is that plant useful for? And also just like destigmatizing things like voodoo, Haitian voodoo, which has, like, growing up was absolutely destigmatized, but also comes with some of those herbal practices that are about embodiment and finding peace and resonance with oneself. So like the question around mental illness, healing, and the many layers to it, and advocating for a holistic approach is something that I very much have been on a journey to discover for myself, as well as through the people that I love and care about. With respect to the Navajo Nation and water, so I was at Sandy Rock back in 2016 when there was a huge push to get people there to challenge the Dakota Access Pipeline from extending there, and being present and seeing the kind of self-activity, the militancy, the organization of folk who came from Ecuador, from other parts of the United States, working in kitchens, creating a tent for like Holy people, and even every morning having a history lesson, just showed me how disingenuous the United States has been and disruptive it has been to indigenous life. The U.S. is on stolen land, as we know, and it has blood on its hands for the genocide that it has created towards indigenous people, and it continues to do. And the fact that it's denying indigenous people water is absolutely disgusting at best, which is horrifying. But it's not that distinct from what we've been seeing in, as you've read and as you know, Flint, Michigan, in Detroit. And so, like, what is happening to indigenous people in the Navajo Nation is very much parallel. It's been happening to Black people in America, and I think this is where, in many ways, having a kind of united left, for example, that is concerned about not just like the Green Deal in an abstract as like, well, we want environmental policies, but environmental policies that have an anti-racist approach, an anti-colonial approach, one that reckons with the land that people are living on and the governmental structure that continues to do harm, both physical and otherwise. I would say that, like, water, you know, not just in the U.S. context, but in the Haitian context, part of what created the cholera, or allowed the cholera epidemic to occur, was that the UN military was dumping its shit, like literally its shit, into the Artibonite River, the major river that provides the Haitians with, you know, and I say the Haitians, but like I'm of Haitian descent, with Haitians for agricultural production, etc. And then that was the sort of the lifeblood of the country. And so, in many ways, destroying, polluting, or withholding water is the very thing that creates many of the health inequalities that we see happening today. And Yemen, you know, being bombed, it doesn't help with having access to clean water. And, you know, it's people in, like, here in Europe, like, I have access to clean water. I'm not being bombed. I have a comfortable living situation. That should not be something special. That should be a universal principle on a global scale. And yet the fact that is happening disproportionately to people of color, to indigenous folk, to Black folk, is a reflection of how little governments like the United States cares for the lives of color. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, yes, and thank you for
sorry.
that. No, that was a great answer, and I really appreciate it. And I find that the importance of water in these struggles and in the conflicts, and the kind of organization that you mentioned around protecting the water. And I remember reading and seeing about the kitchens that were being made, and I was just like, wow, that seems like real organizational work that is like structural and has a purpose and has a long-term goal, like long-term horizons, and kind of like it seemed a type of organizational approach towards fighting against something that I didn't see reflected in other protests that I had seen get attention in mainstream media and so forth. And so like when you bring that up, that just resonated, especially again with me.
I wanted to go back a little bit, although this definitely connects. You had mentioned this concept of medical apartheid, and that certainly relates to not only past epidemics and issues that have in the health field or the area of health, but also now in particular. And we certainly see a sort of stark bifurcation between those who are covered by insurance, those who have access to medical care, those who whose bodies are just in better shape to deal with a virus like coronavirus or COVID-19 versus those who are not. And what's been fascinating to watch, and I mean fascinating in the most dark way, of course, is that in the press, for example, and by certain medical professionals who are affiliated with the Trump administration, the discussion sort of is framed around Black and Latino populations as though they're bringing it upon themselves. So often when you hear this discussion about, oh, it's affecting people of color more, then it turns into a question of, well, what are people of color, what are their eating habits like? What are their health habits like, their lifestyles? Maybe if they were just a little bit healthier, if they weighed a little less, if they had less diabetes, whatever, fill in the blank, they would be less susceptible and therefore wouldn't be getting coronavirus and dying. And so I'm feeling like that kind of tone setting by the general population is what's also, adding to the sort of segregation of response. And you see a very big difference between like protesters, and I'm laughing just because it's so absurd that people are protesting, like wearing a mask, right, to protect themselves and others. But this idea of like, we're not going to die, we're invincible, and the people who are dying, we just have to trim the fat. We've got old people and Black people and Latinos. Who needs them, right? Despite the fact that they're often like, people of color are often the frontline workers, not only, and I think this is the other thing that's weird, not only in terms of like at grocery stores as delivery people, but also in the actual hospitals. Like so many people who are working in hospitals in a variety of capacities are of color, are from immigrant populations, quote unquote disposable people for the same people who are going out and protesting and who then might need their life saved by one of these types of individuals, right? So I'm curious to kind of know, how does what you've been looking at in past and present work kind of correlate to these divisions? And I'm also, I'm in particular, I'm curious about what you were saying about Haiti and Haitian immigrants, and I see some parallels here as well, because I grew up in I was born in the 80s. I remember when there was the boat lift, the Mariel Boatlift, and there was all these discussions about, is it possible that some of the Cubans ended up getting AIDS from these Haitians? And the response was different between, the popular response was different towards the Cuban boat lift versus the migrants that were coming from Haiti, and how that was sort of framed in the press. So I'm just wondering like what your thoughts are that kind of bridge past and present work that you're doing and our current pandemic, especially as it relates to race, migration, and sort of, I guess, stereotypes and bias in the medical field.
So I would say to get to the beginning of your question on medical apartheid, I would highly recommend, if people haven't already, read Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, which very much goes into the history of the United States of medicine, power, experimentation, and how specifically the U.S. government and medical practitioners in like the 19th century under slavery and beyond experimented on slaves and free persons, and how Black bodies were put onto displays or put a part of surgical theaters. And that wasn't unique to the US, actually. And here in Europe, there were surgical anatomical theaters where Black people were experimented on in the Netherlands. Here in Germany, there are ways in which the kind of hierarchies, and particularly pseudoscience that is tied to racism, impacted who would get experimented on and who wouldn't. And a lot of the, I would say, excellent work by people like Dorothy Roberts as well, who wrote this very excellent book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, where she tries to unpack some of the stereotypes that people had, particularly scientists and practitioners, on Black women's fertility, government public programs that coerce thousands of Black women into being sterilized, to ideas about Black motherhood and reproduction, the so-called crack babies, and how that then impacted public health policies more broadly, and how specifically Black mothers disproportionately were being criminalized in the late 80s, early 90s. So there's a long history to the vilification of Black people and people of color more broadly, and a lot of that is tied to either in some cases, wanting us to reproduce the next set of workers, laborers, and slaves. In other cases, experimenting upon us because they didn't see us as fully human. In other cases, once they were like, well, we're done with them, wanting to sterilize us and wanting us not to reproduce. In fact, the state of North Carolina, I was just reading, didn't abolish its eugenics program until the 1970s. 1970s, and in some cases, and of the 7,000 people that they had sterilized, 5,000 of them were Black. This is part of how racism operates in the kind of medical realm or in the history of medicine. There's no reason. Well, A, you shouldn't be sterilizing anyone, and two, at the end of the day, our bodies, for a good chunk of the history of the United States, weren't our own, and we didn't have that autonomy to just live freely. So then when you come then to, circa 2020, and there's a pandemic, a global pandemic, you see in not just the US context, but also the British context in the UK, people who are, and in the British context, they call people of color, Black and minority ethnic, in the US, Black, and people of color more broadly, there is a disproportionate amount of people of color who are either being infected or by the disease, by COVID-19, and or dying from it. And it's not because of our biology. There's nothing about us as individuals, but rather because of the health inequities that exist, racism within the institutions, the fact that we're disproportionately on the front lines. So for example, in my family, my mother is a cleaner, a janitor, and she works at a public hospital in Miami, and she works 5 days a week, sometimes 6. And her floor got turned into a coronavirus floor where she has to clean up and do that labor. There are other people in my family, my aunts, who are also cleaners. They go to work every day. Like my cousins, they work as nurses, etc. And so I recently read a statistic that showed that 80% of Black workers can't just work from home. They have to actually go physically into a place, like what you mentioned, to the grocery store, to work as a cashier in some cases, to be a cleaner, to be doing the front line of work. And so just our very exposure is the thing that disproportionately impacts us. And I think that the protests that you mentioned aren't unique, actually, unfortunately, to the US. Some of that is happening here in Germany as well, where people are protesting, wanting to open things up because they see it as infringing upon their civil liberties, allegedly. And I find it quite delusional, and in some ways, it speaks to a certain kind of bias supremacy that white people have, and a callousness and selfishness that is that needs to be challenged outright. And at the end of the day, it's going to cost the lives of, like you said, the frontline workers who are disproportionately people of color, who are going to be exposed to those same people who are putting our lives at risk, and then we're expected disproportionately to be taking care of them. So the thing that I find troubling in this moment is that it's just another version of a long history of racism in the medical field, racism in how people see our bodies, and the kind of incompetence to really honor our lives and our health on a societal level. So turning then to Haiti and Haitians, like there have been heaps of people who've spoken and written about Haiti and the relationship between how Haitians were stigmatized for HIV/AIDS, and how Haitians as a group, and it was the only ethnic group that was blamed for the disease. So the other groups being hemophiliacs, homosexuals, etc. And what that meant in the case of people who were Haitian in places like Miami, New York, etc., that they might not have been able to live in certain forms of housing, and in some cases were seen being as being the less desirable migrant, especially compared to the Cuban population in Miami, and that came then also with certain types of labor that people could have. So most of the people who migrated in my family in the 80s ended up just working as either day laborers, picking beans and tomatoes in the fields. In some cases, they worked in textile industry. In some cases, they worked as cleaners. And so the racialization and stigmatization of who their identity and who they were then impacted the kinds of labor, the kinds of opportunities that they could have, especially as working class Haitians. And so it's a long history, and it's very complex, and it obviously has personal dimensions, but it is something that I think that a recent example of how the racialization of epidemics has played out is what we see with the Ebola virus, and particularly how at the time that it arose, it very much impacted the extent to which West Africans then were seen as a vector disease, and how migration patterns would happen, and the kinds of policies that were put into place. Once that was stifled a bit, the disease and the kind of very racialized perceptions about Ebola diminished somewhat, but they haven't necessarily completely gone away. So one of the things that I at least as a kind of theoretical framework, trying to think about when unpacking the racialized dynamics of some of these epidemics, some of these things, is like Achille Mbembe's notion of necropolitics, where how is it that human existence, and particularly Black human existence, is relegated to a kind of bodily autonomy that isn't fully recognized, but not just stopping there, like what then do we do about it? Because like all of these major inequalities, like people know about them, they've documented it. It's like if you're a person of color, Black person, like you know it's the case. And I think that the next step, especially if one is committed to like full human liberation, is like, what do we do to stop these injustices from happening? And how do we destigmatize the very people who need the most care?
I wanted to ask you too about your work that you had written in a few months ago. Actually, I saw that you had several pieces about universal healthcare. And as someone who had been traveling between Germany and the UK, obviously you have some direct experience and exposure to that. But your article in particular it was sort of a warning about the ways that universal healthcare and the NHS in particular had been sort of underserving the BAME population, right? And how that could potentially spill over into the United States, especially considering the pre-existing bias in healthcare towards, against, I should say, Black and brown people. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that as well, because that sort of feeds into what you were just saying about some of the exposure and risks that people of color already have in the fields that they're sort of forced to work in on the basis of economic disparities. If you could talk about that, and also kind of, you mentioned this in passing, but the way that Germany has been responding to this and what's going on. And you had mentioned also some of the anxieties in particular over immigration. And obviously, world leaders are kind of, some of them at least, are framing this as a matter of just like shutting borders and thus shutting out the virus, when we know that's not how these things work. So kind of, if you could bridge these two issues and discuss for us, what's going on both of those fronts.
Yeah, so the National Health Service, or the NHS, which formed in 1948 in the UK, is as a universal health program, is one of the best that you can have in terms of centralizing medical care, making it pretty much free for people, and really creating a situation where you are guaranteed care and you don't go into debt for going to the hospital. At the same time, that system was also built on the kind of post-World War II period in which the British Empire invited colonial, not just colonial subjects, but actual citizens, people who had been citizens of the empire, so from Jamaica, formerly from India, etc. And many of the people who ended up filling some of the vacancies that were needed for the NHS came from former colonies in some cases, and were people of color, and then later on, people from continental Europe. And so the foundation of something like the NHS was built on the Windrush. So this is the kind of invitation, or so-called invitation, from the British Empire to bring people from the Caribbean and beyond to help rebuild the UK. As an institution, the NHS has kind of gotten under some scrutiny over the past several years for several reasons. One of them being a rise in austerity, so the government cutting back on funding. And so many of the services aren't as efficient as they used to be, and semi-privatization in some cases and other parts. So this is a kind of economic situation that is quite damaging to a public program that at the basis it should be quite accessible. The other element is the scrutiny around racism, particularly people of Black and minority ethnic people, whether as patients or as practitioners, have spoken to or indicated having painful experiences. And so in the Baffler article that I had written, How They Treat Us, I interviewed several people who in some cases were Black British, or just Black folk who were European, about their access to care under the NHS. And they spoke about some of the discrimination that they experienced, and in other cases they saw it as perfectly fine. But what one finds is that there is more likelihood of discrimination based off of one's experience of being a person of color. Beyond that, and this is where Brexit comes into play, that there was an effort by the British Home Office to start cracking down, quote unquote, on migrants or people that were not documented in their system, and leading to the Windrush scandal, where people who had been living in Britain for decades were suddenly told that they could not be there. So that meant then that they could not access the health services. And so in one case, there's one particular person who sought to access care and was originally told to pay like thousands of British pounds to continue his cancer treatment. And so things like this were emerging. It's like, well, on the one hand, there was a history to people like, and the name of that person was Albert Thompson, who was told he had to produce a British passport to access the cancer treatment, and that if he didn't, then he would either have to pay £54,000 or leave. And he had been living in Britain at that point for several decades, and it's just, to me, absolutely scandalous that a medical system could do that. And even though it was built by the labor of people who had been part of the British Empire, people who were in the colonial context. So reading about this, interviewing people who had had direct experiences with the NHS, it kind of goes to show that it's not enough to say we have a universal program without actually putting into place anti-racist policies, without actually funding it in the way that it needs to be. So the question around austerity is a major issue towards why the program, why the NHS has been failing not just patients and but also doctors and nurses who are part of that system, who are overworked and underpaid. So that to me, or the NHS example, is one that should tell us if we're going to have Medicare for all in the US context, or not just in the US context, but in Mozambique, in Uganda, then it has to be well funded. It has to actually be democratic. It has to provide care to everyone and not reproduce discriminatory practices that are embedded in society. Turning to Germany, Germany is it's an interesting place to be at the moment, insofar that I would say of the European countries, it's done quite well with respect to having a lower death rate compared to Italy and the UK. Early on, there was a lockdown in some of the provinces. And in some cases, for people, particularly if you are a freelancer or if you're a person who has lost work, then you could have applied for state funds, and the state provided funds quite immediately. And then beyond that, there's been far more testing compared to like the United States, etc. At the same time, and this is the thing that I and others have found disturbing, is that thousands of people have been gathering in cities across Germany, particularly last weekend and weekends prior, to protest the current lockdown. And some of those people actually are part of radical extremists, anti-vaxxers, anti-Semitic groups. And so there's a parallel between those who are part of these protests to open up the government and the right wing and conservatives. So it's not that different from the United States with respect to the face of those people. Granted, Germany is a majority white country, and there isn't as large of a POC population here, but we do exist. There are people of Turkish descent who've been here for generations. There's been a Black population here for ages, especially given that Germany had colonies on the African continent, Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, as well as people who are descendants of Black Americans who are also here. So there's a complex history of people who are, and I should also say this, which is an Arab population, people who are recent refugees from Syria, etc., who are also here, especially in light of the 2015 opening of migration here. So there are people who have various heritage that aren't just European, who live here, and seeing these demonstrations, not just in small towns or Munich and Stuttgart, but here in Berlin, has been troubling for me. And it feels quite similar to what I'm seeing on television or on the computer. Actually, I don't have a television, to what I'm seeing in the US. And part of, it's not the case that leftist, anti-racist people are the ones who are protesting. It's literally white, far-right people.
So what does that look like? Because are they also posing a threat in terms of access to healthcare. Because one of the things I saw, for example, in Brazil,
Mm-hmm.
is that the far right had been they'd been doing protests on the roads and thus blocking access to hospitals for ambulances, and thus, obviously limiting access to hospitals for people who are suffering from the symptoms of COVID-19. So what do the protests look like in the German context, and what's been the response by the government? Has it been one to actually protect the migrant population, people of color, and people who are, or people who are suffering from the disease, or has there been sort of a response of indifference?
So there are different responses depending on who people are. So I would say that amongst leftist anti-racist groups that I'm aware of and that I know, so it's like, for example, the International Women's Space, which has been doing a lot of work around women, migrant refugees and provide aid and care, food services, all kinds of things, and to encourage. And actually, they've been encouraging things like social distancing. There are groups like IOTO, Each One Teach One, which is like has been doing a lot of education around African diasporic stuff, and so they've been doing a lot of teach-ins and online stuff. There's people who've been doing mutual aid here in Berlin, where they deliver and make sure that there's food for the homeless and or other kinds of food for people who are physically impaired. And there's also been, depending on the neighborhood, in the beginning, but not so much now, clapping 7 p.m. in the afternoon for healthcare workers and things of that nature. And then there have been, particularly in towns in the West and some here in Berlin, Black migrants who are in the refugee camps and in lagers, as they call them, who've been having online digital socially distant protests about why social distancing is a privilege and how there should be more services and more facilities that could allow them to actually be socially distant in a similar fashion. Because in some cases, people can be in a room like as a refugee with like 9 other people, poor ventilation, circulation, etc. So the people who are actually the most disenfranchised and who have an anti-racist leftist policy have been quite active in having mutual aid, teach-ins, online forums, and things of that nature. There's another group who is on the far right, I would say, who've been protesting to fully open up the government to demonstrate in mass, which at this point isn't really allowed, and have been doing so like often on weekends, not necessarily in the way that you're describing in Brazil. So they're not blocking healthcare workers, or not like stopping ambulances from coming or anything like that. However, so they're either protesting on the street, or in some cases, and I wrote about this in Spectre Journal, denying that coronavirus is a problem. Like in some cases, there have been a couple of German scientists, I would say they call themselves, who say that, well, there's 20,000 people who die of the flu every year, so this isn't that different. This is just a panic that is being created by, and then they list their, what I would call a conspiracy theory, and this is something that is a bit. It was happening more in the beginning of March, but has somewhat alighted since then because the cases have increased. So one of the German scientists who had a corona denialism was Wolfgang Wodak, who had a YouTube video that went viral called Corona Lie. And he basically said virologists created something sensational here. Another person, and she's a professor and director of Institute of Medical Virology, Dr. Karen Mullen at the University of Zurich, so that's in Switzerland actually, also indicated that coronavirus is not a serious killer and that the real problem is scaremongering. So there are people, whether they're the protesters who have been coming out on some of the weekends to want to fully open things up, and who've been kind of denying the impact of coronavirus. And then there's people who have a doctorate or PhD who literally are saying that this is not a big deal and it's a sensation and it's people die all the time from common cold and flu. So what's the big deal? So it's been a bit schizophrenic to kind of witness and go like reading some of this stuff and seeing what's going on. While also seeing that as a state and a government, the German government has actually been doing far more than the US. But the thing is part of the problem is like the barometer shouldn't be the US or what the German state has done up to this point. We should be expecting like far more. We should be having like free testing on demand. We should have like everyone who needs any kind of like assistance, just immediate. Refugees and migrants who are like these, like I want more space, like I need more space. That should have been the case like 3-4 years ago. Like some of these people have been in refugee camps for years and haven't been placed into permanent housing or permanent jobs or anything. And so the coronavirus is actually forcing us to think about, well, what are the problems and issues that have existed and how people been barely surviving, and what do we do to readjust that? Of course, capitalism is the problem, and like the entire system is flawed. And the fact that some people are so caught up on the economy and not actual lives and the living conditions that people have has been the thing that has revealed like who's on the side of actual people and the working class, and ensuring that we can survive as a collective, and who just cares about the dollar, euro, pound, whatever you want to call it. It's just this is the debate that's going to determine the extent to which we come out of this, if we do anytime soon, with actual policies that improve the lives rather than completely immiserate them.
That sounds very familiar. At least the response that you mentioned about the academics, at least, who are kind of like, it's no different than the flu. Or I mean, I'm tired of hearing this comparison, as we know and have proof to the contrary.
One of the things that you both discussed that stuck out to me was about the frontline workers, and we know that, especially in the U.S., that there's been rationing of the PPE gear, and the compounding effects of the class and race has meant that a lot of like the frontline nurses have been relegated to the less effective gear, while some of the more affluent and predominantly more whiter doctors and so forth are given access to the better and more effective gear. And we've seen that trickle all the way down to workers, to, like you said, the janitors assigned to the COVID floors and elsewhere in the essential businesses that we've seen. And with just the descriptions of what you talked about, I'm reminded constantly of like MLK's White Moderate when you talk about universal health care, where there's a push for a universal program and kind of worrying about the anti-racist part later. And then also of Baldwin's Moral Monsters, when you describe some of the horrors just wrought by Western governments around the world in these oppressed places. But one of the things that I was curious about, and I think that you might be able to shed some light on, is just kind of speaking to what I would say is kind of an arguably reasoned skepticism among certain populations of Western medicine and of experimental things versus kind of the anti-vaxxer crowd that you're describing at some of these protests, and then balancing that also with, as you also mentioned, the kind of capitalist motives behind a rapid development of a vaccine, and perhaps safety as not a top concern among some of the actors in that development.
Yeah, I think that, well, turning to the rationing, that was one of the major concerns I had about my mom when she indicated that her floor was being turned into a coronavirus floor. Just that what did it mean for her to have to, as a worker, a Black immigrant woman, etc., have to stand up for herself. So she, luckily enough, is in a labor union, and her labor union tried to fight for her, and not just her, but the other workers, to suggest that like they have to be provided with adequate equipment. And so there was a period where she wasn't going to work because they didn't have it. Because at first they had suggested to, like, what kind of like what you're saying, the dynamic of, well, she's not a doctor, she's not white, but to give her lesser materials that would have exposed her more to potential patients. And luckily, she was able to avoid that. But if she wasn't part of a labor union that was helping to facilitate that work and having other workers who also challenge that, then it would be a different story for me to be talking about this. And so there has to be, I would say, if we're going to think about labor and the frontline workers who are actually providing that care, labor unions need to step up. The rank and file need to be able to have the platform. And luckily there have been people writing about this, like Sarah Jaffe, a journalist, has been writing extensively on healthcare workers and the extent to which they're doing and challenging some of the problems in the workplace. So the labor question and what kind of gear people are provided is going to be something that also is tied to unionization, representation, and the precarity of labor more broadly. And it also begs the question, what are unions doing to increase their membership, and to not just do it with people who are full-time, but those who are contracted, part-time, etc., or in some cases even just reaching out to the unemployed. It's like the most effective labor struggle we're going to have is one in which you actually aren't just tying yourself to the employed, but the lumpen proletariat. We're just like the reserve workers, and that could potentially be a way to strengthen some of these movements.
You mentioned kind of the experimental kind of treatments, running from the Tuskegee type stuff, and then also the anti-vaxxer crowd, though, that is showing up at these kind of open up protests, and the people that say that this isn't a problem. But then I guess also was curious about the impact of the capitalist motives towards the development of vaccine, and just kind of how or what kind of insight can you provide to navigating that space of, well, these people have a reasonable suspicion of something like an experimental vaccine being produced and distributed in Africa, as I've seen being proposed several times, but then also not be lumped in with the kind of open up anti-vaxxer crowd or give that any kind of credence where it doesn't belong.
Yeah, so that's a very important question, a very good question, especially since particularly the first part and the history of experimentation on Black folk and what that would mean. As you know, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, had suggested that, or not suggested, had made the request that perhaps Africa could be the place to potentially test a coronavirus vaccine, and that caused a huge uproar, specifically because Africa has been a laboratory, unfortunately, and it shouldn't be. So the French have no business to further cause harm on that continent, and I would say that it is important for us to question and challenge any form of experimentation, especially those that are tied to neo-colonial regimes in the current moment. And tied to that, you point up a good point. You make a good point about what does it mean to, in a sober manner, recognize that there are for-profit pharmaceutical companies that are now on the race to find a coronavirus vaccine, and what does that kind of economic incentive mean for like us as people who could potentially benefit from that, and or what does it mean to re-envision or to have another kind of model for developing a vaccine that isn't so profit driven. I would say that there are a couple of things that we should be pushing for, which is that it shouldn't be private pharmaceutical companies doing that work. In fact, it should be state-driven physicians, scientists, etc. In fact, like a lot of public universities, whether it's University of Washington, University of California, those are publicly funded universities that should be getting that funding to develop those vaccines, as opposed to a private corporation. There's no reason why Pfizer should be getting a kind of cut, a government cut to develop something versus state universities that have actually been very much defunding and experiencing austerities since the 2008 crisis. And so part of what I would say needs to happen, if there's going to be a nuanced kind of way of dealing with this tension between for-profit pharmaceutical companies that are trying to develop a vaccine versus the reality of wanting something that can benefit like the majority of people, is to reshuffle where these government-funded initiative and programs go, so that that can actually be more state-driven. Because if it is more state-driven, then it ensures that it's not going to undergo the model of having some, an expensive patent, and then be expensive to reproduce, and then creating further inequalities once that medication is produced. And part of why that matters is because when antiretroviral therapy was first developed, it wasn't cheap. And what that meant was that by the late 90s, when people needed treatment for HIV/AIDS in Southern Africa, they couldn't afford it. And it wasn't until people protested, particularly South Africa, Uganda, etc., and to lower the prices, that the rate of HIV/AIDS decreased on the African continent. And so the question about pricing for drugs, vaccines, etc., can actually cost lives. And so if there needs to be, I would say, if from a leftist perspective, from a kind of health policy perspective, to say that we can no longer be funding, especially using government funding, to help pharmaceutical companies developing these vaccines and or medical advancements, but that has to be put towards already existing state universities, institutions, who could then ensure that stuff is readily available and isn't going to be on a for-profit patented system.
I think that's an excellent point, and especially with regards to funding the state universities, particularly because not only with the austerity that they've been experiencing, as you mentioned, since 2008, but also with the dramatic cut in funding that they're experiencing, and some governors are already looking to cut their funding further to make up the shortfall from the lack of tax revenue resulting from the pandemic. But with that, Wendy, I think you wanted to get in there?
Yeah, so switching gears just a little bit before we close, I had some questions for you, or a general question actually, about academia. Considering you're in academia and you're doing a postdoctoral fellowship, correct? How is that going in the pandemic, first of all? What is your trajectory now, considering what's happening and your work? And then also, kind of, how do you see academia as a whole changing amid the pandemic? And what are some steps, perhaps, as researchers, scholars, people in the field, but also those who are interested in helping? What do you think our role could be going forward to make sure that the education system as a whole doesn't completely collapse and turn into like some capitalist hellscape that I foresee, unfortunately?
So I would say a couple things. I'm currently in academia as a postdoctoral fellow, but my fellowship ends this summer. So I will be unemployed after the summer. So my trajectory is a bit uncertain with respect to having a permanent position. And that isn't unique to me. In fact, as you might know, there are less tenured or permanent positions that are available for the amount of people who have PhDs, and the neoliberalization of universities over the past several decades has been contributed to that. And we see, as Richard pointed out, with the kind of austerity that's happening at the California state system or Wisconsin, etc., that at the end of the day, there's just not a guarantee that just because you have a PhD, you'll be able to have a position. And beyond that, people, particularly governors and university administrators, are using this virus and this pandemic to do the ill will of either firing people. This happened in, I think it was in Ohio. They just fired a bunch of non-tenured people and using the pandemic as a license to do so. Or in some cases, jobs that were supposed to be permanent are suddenly short-term contracted positions. So there is, I would say, it's not a new crisis, but now a further measure in the crisis for academia and as a whole. And I think some of that is pushing people. I was speaking to someone from my former institution because we were part of a unionization drive or attempt at Princeton for grad students. And now, because of people are suddenly without a certain kind of compensation, et cetera, are not able to do the research, they're organizing. And this is a moment to organize, I would say, if a person is affiliated with an academic institution, because if we don't, then they can easily, as university administrators, et cetera, get away with terminating positions. And that is something that I fear. I think that part of what is difficult, and it's not just related to academia, is that for a generation like myself, who I moved to New York City in 2008 to start grad school, and that was when the crash happened. And I've been living through it ever since. And it's not just, not having certain opportunities, but it's been tied to having student loan debt at $120,000 at this point. And it's tied to not having a home. It's tied to not having a permanent job and figuring out, in my own way, what it means to survive in a world that wasn't built for Black scholars to really exist and be confident and fully present in some of these majority white spaces. So I'm figuring that out. I guess what I could say is that for the time that I have in the academic sphere, what I've been trying to do as much as I can is to bring voice to the groups that I've encountered and met who often didn't have one. So for example, interviewing recently a transgender Black migrant who lives here in Germany about their access to health, and their transitioning process and what that looks like, and what role that may have in them moving through this world. Or in some cases, chatting with I was about a month and a half, 2 months ago, a migrant refugee from Kenya and their experience here in Germany and their organizing efforts. And that has in some ways given me so much more inspiration than going to the academic conference. So in some ways, the actual work of connecting to humans and people, and to figure out what we can do to build the world, or to work on building the world that we want, has been what I've been committed to recently. And it's been wonderful. It's been wonderful to see the bravery of the Black Indigenous POC climate activists here in Germany, in Berlin, who were challenging the coal dependency that Germany has, or to really learn from the various Afro-Deutsch people and learning about the Black German history here. But I guess at the end of the day, I would say that with the future of academia, it's going to be a future that's going to have to, be organized by, people have to see themselves as workers and to organize accordingly. B, to make actual demands where we demand full employment and guaranteed employment. C, we have to actually have spaces that are not just somehow siphoned off or feel like it's an ivory tower, but actually accessible to communities. You can't have a situation, and I witnessed this when I was doing my master's at Columbia, where Harlem residents don't feel comfortable walking onto Columbia. There can't be that kind of division with an extremely rich university towering itself over a community and making it itself inaccessible. Universities have to be truly universal to a wide range of people. And so I think that is going to then require those who are in privileged positions within the universities, so tenured people who have full salaries, etc., to help do that work, so that there isn't this division or this hazing or a hierarchical system where people are just pushed out, and disproportionately, unfortunately, people of color, people from working class backgrounds, people who are migrants. And I've seen, especially over the past couple of years, colleagues of mine, friends of mine who are from similar backgrounds like myself, like person of color, immigrant background, working class, and who grew up working poor, that we don't end up making it. And that's just the kind of ways in which academia actually often reproduces the people who come from more wealthy and or upper class backgrounds. So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if I have hope in it, and I'm not sure if I can do much to help change it as an individual who may not be in it, academia for that much longer. But for the time that I have left, I think I'll continue to to ask questions, to agitate, to have co-researchers with the people that I know who I honor and respect, and who do the same towards me, and hope that one day it will change.
Here's hoping, especially now as universities are trying to act like nothing is happening all of a sudden. I keep seeing alerts that like schools are just going to reopen in the fall, like there's no pandemic and no like major economic crisis, and no people who are like homeschooling their kids and doing the cooking and the cleaning and the care and all of that on top of working. We'll see how that goes.
Send over those tuition checks and we'll figure it out afterwards.
Exactly. But we'll see. But anyway, listen, I hope that the project work that you're doing, I know you have your hand in several things that we talked about a bit in the intro, but I definitely think that will all have an impact. And I hope that going forward, you can find your place there, wherever you end up, and that it's healthy and happy and fulfilling for you and for all of us. To be honest, I think we're all kind of like looking at the horizon and going, wait a second, what happened to my career or potential career? So this might be, despite how tragic it has been and is, it might be a kind of turning point for a lot of us to really put our feet in different waters. But we'll see what happens.
One thing I would say is, I totally forgot to mention this, which is one place that I put my foot into is podcasting. So through the podcast that I run or co-run called Decolonization in Action. And in some ways that has been such a fulfilling platform for me to be able to experiment with sound and to meet new people, and to, as an introvert, force myself to talk to people and construct a conversation of sorts. And it actually gives me a kind of, I like more people listen to my podcast, I imagine, than reading an academic journal article that I write. Or so there's also that element, just like accessibility in terms of language and conversations that published pieces in journals may not always provide.
Absolutely. It's always nice to have kind of a different space to talk about those issues. And on that note, I would love to have you back as well to talk about your work on like kind of repatriation projects and tourism in Africa, which is amazing. That's like a totally separate issue that I'm super interested in. And especially thinking about colonialism that's practiced, or the kind of forms of colonialism practiced through tourism, and that unfortunately people of color and descendants of the very places where they're going can kind of reinscribe and reiterate and exacerbate. So we need to have you on for another time, and we'll definitely put out, this is it.
You opened with talking about undoing imperialism with your scholarship and building relationships on the ground, and that really resonated with me. And I think that this the struggle gives us the opportunity to kind of see each other in the struggles that we face internationally and locally, and also see each other in our successes. And so the work that you're doing is an inspiration to me. And so, and the relationships that you're developing are inspirational to me. And you mentioned introversion as well. And so like all those types of things are very helpful towards me. And so like, I wish I had somebody to look toward. You mentioned also, I guess, the absence of the stories of achievements of scientists and academics outside of the kind of European sphere. And so I'm glad that you can be a part of a next generation story. And I'm just pleased to hopefully help that generation discover your amazing work.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's an uncertain time, so I'm feeling all kinds of things like I said, I don't know what's going to happen after the summer, and I'm trying to work through that. Because at the end of the day, certain people get rewarded and others don't.
Listen, thank you so much, Edna, for being a guest. For those of you who are interested, of course, follow up with her. There's information in, as always, the show notes. More information where Edna's work can be found and her podcast, etc. So please check that out. And as always, thank you all so much for listening, and have a good one. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Left Pocket Project. As per usual, you can find us on social media by searching for Left POC, and that's LEFT POC. And of course, you can find us on Patreon, where everything is free, all of the resources, all of the episodes, and that's something that we plan to keep on doing for the rest of the duration of the podcast. But I wanted to just remind everyone that if you can spare $1 or $2 or more at the moment, please feel free to add us to your giving list. We use your funds for everything related to the podcast. It all goes back into the podcast, but also out into the community. Everyone, thanks again. Please stay safe, stay at home, protect yourselves, your family and friends, and just try to support each other in these times. I know it's kind of cliche and everyone's tired of hearing that, but it's something that we definitely need to do, and make sure that we look out for one another. So anyway, be safe, be careful, and we'll talk to you soon.